Welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we have a very special guest. Today we have on William Haldeman. He's Vice Chancellor and Chief Strategy Officer at the University of Pittsburgh. He has also served the White House Domestic Policy Council, 2 U.S. Secretaries of State, and as a senior staff member to a state governor. And his new book, available now, is called Meeting the Moment, Inspiring Presidential Leadership That Transformed America. Bill, it's a pleasure to have you on, and thank you so much for being here today.
Great to be with you.
Absolutely. And so, as we usually do to start from a passage from the book, Bill wrote, "The stories to follow demonstrate that the presidents who navigated this intersection most acutely were those who exemplified the right qualities at the right times, like having the experience and instincts to make the right call when it matters most, the ingenuity to identify opportunity around a bend, the dedication to see through a great cause, the courage to act at the intersection of one's passion and purpose, the confidence to hearten the downtrodden, and the optimism to break through seemingly impenetrable barriers. By holding ourselves and our leaders to this standard, we remind the next American generation of bellwethers of what we are and can be as a nation. We remind an American polity in an era of partisan gridlock, the 24-hour news cycle, and the proliferation of social media, that if we hold firm to these ideals, any talk of an American deadline and of an American decline in standing or world power is simply empty conversation. And we remind the world, as John Winthrop preached to his fellow Puritans in 1630, quote unquote, that we shall be a city upon the hill, the eyes of all people are upon us. Wonderful writing. So, Bill, okay, so the first question is going to be, I mean, it's pretty much the obvious one. Why did you choose the presidents you chose? Because, I mean, obviously you could have focused on God knows how many of them, but you chose 5 in particular.
So the focus of it was the fact that I wanted to look at who are the best presidents that we've had. And traditionally, you can look at C-SPAN polls, Wall Street Journal polls of historians, and they traditionally there's a group of 10 or so presidents that usually stick out. So I looked over the scope of American history. Who are those leaders? And that's really how I pulled them. So you have your Washingtons, your Jeffersons, your Lincolns, the 2 Roosevelts, and Reagan. I wanted to span them out in across American history, but in essentially a nonpartisan way to show that leadership is not about party; it's about moving the nation forward. And that was the goal of it, to try to pick some of the best presidents we've had, or what historians view as the best presidents we've ever had.
Oh, wow.
And now, what I find very interesting is that the book highlights 6 key qualities of leadership that you highlighted in the book: judgment, ingenuity, dedication, courage, confidence, and optimism. I'm just curious, why did you choose those particular traits, and how do they interconnect?
So I went back and looked at each leader at their key moment of crisis, their key moment of decision, and what was it about them and what was about their leadership that really stuck out. And what came out was really 6 different unique qualities for each of these. So it was a unique quality, one quality for each of these leaders that were unique to them. So you look at someone like Washington and it was his judgment. You look at someone like FDR, it was his confidence. But interestingly, it was something that they had, this was a quality that they had throughout their life. They were cultivating this from childhood, and in that key moment of decision, that key moment of their leadership moment, that was the quality that shone through. So it just happened to be that there was a unique quality for each of these 6 leaders, which lends me to the conclusion that I don't think that there's a set criteria for leadership. I think all these leaders had these types of qualities, but I think it's really the leader and the circumstance that really draws that out.
Okay, so let's start from the beginning. So George Washington, can you tell us a little bit about him and the quality that you chose for him?
Sure. So judgment is my view on George Washington. He's someone he learned by doing. He learned by going to war. Combat was essentially his classroom. He wasn't classically trained like folks like John Adams or Thomas Jefferson. Rather, he learned by doing. He learned by getting things wrong. So he lost more battles than he won during the American Revolution. And I think the thing about his judgment, you'd say, well, if he was getting all these things wrong, why is this his judgment? He had the innate capacity to get the big things right. I think in every step of his way across as leading the Revolutionary Army, as president, he ended up getting the big things right to set America up for where it needed to go. So for me, it was that aspect of judgment for Washington.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he could have been essentially another king if he wanted to, but he had that wisdom, that judgment to decide, okay, no, I'm going to step down. I find that interesting. Do you think like any of our contemporary leaders show that kind of wisdom? Do you see that anywhere by any chance, or is that something that you think that they should take that as a lesson, as something to learn and still embody?
I think we all can learn that. I mean,
Of course.
there's a humbleness.
Yeah.
There was. I mean, Washington had a humongous ego, but he also
Hmm.
knew what needed to be done at the time. And you could look at someone like LBJ step down. You look at Harry Truman step down. You look at Joe Biden step down. I mean, the decisions around those certainly are different. I mean, in most of the cases, recent cases, the party that was in power lost power.
Hmm.
Well, in the case of Washington, he stepped down and John Adams stepped in and really was of the same party and was able to continue many of the precedents that Washington had established. But I think overall, I think we all can learn from that. I mean, there's an element of knowing when to step aside. Are you the quarterback who knows that's it? Like you go out on
Right.
top. I think Washington went out on top, and I think there's something to be said for that.
Yeah.
You know what's crazy to me? His farewell address. Funny thing is, in it he makes mention of warnings of about political factions. Right. I find that
Hmm.
eerily relevant today, especially in our polarized political climate. And it's insane to me that he knew to even talk about something like that then. I mean, of course, that's relevant to the time that he said it, but it's interesting how had just scare like that's just so relevant today, right?
Totally. So
Yeah,
interestingly, the 1790s, his period,
yeah.
was some of the most divisive politics that we've seen in our country. You wouldn't think that. You think, oh my God, today this is the worst that we've ever had it. But that's what essentially Washington was writing about in his farewell address. He was concerned about the rise of politics. He was concerned about this aspect of disunity that would lead essentially 60, 70 years later to civil war. He was concerned about that. And you see, there's interesting parallels between the 70s, 90s, and you look at just contemporary times. We had France interfering in our own national elections to the point where
Hmm.
Washington had to recall the French ambassador, send him back to France. You had as you said, the rise of politics and partisanship. The partisan press came into play. The two-party system started to be that influx of that. And there's also this cry of fake news even then. So
Hmm. Wow.
you see that dynamic. There's a lot of parallels between Washington time and our own time, and you're talking almost 200 and some years later.
Wow, man. Yeah, and so I don't know, Bill, how keen you are on getting into sort of contemporary politics, but I will just make this comment. So about judgment, I think a lot of times, and since we are talking about partisan politics, we think my party is the party of good judgment, and I got to tell you, man. So in the past couple of months, I've really lost faith in the Democratic Party, especially with Biden pardoning his kid, and then so like we're kind of as we're reading, kind of some of the literature on these people, like as in this case George Washington, who is an example of good judgment, and I think for politicians, we often think of the story of Cincinnatus, which is this Roman tale about this person who was a farmer at the time. So Rome went to war with Carthage. Essentially, he said, I don't want to be a politician, but I'm going to go forth and I'm going to protect my people. And then
Hmm.
essentially he gives it all up when the time comes and he says, here, you guys can take power. I just want to go back to my family and be a farmer. And so I think for a lot of us in our kind of like sphere, I'm sure Republicans feel the same way. But like for us in the Democratic sphere, I think we think of that. Oh, I think we think of our people as being that, as like these sort of beacons of humility in some sense. And I got to tell you, man, it's been pretty disheartening to see Biden in the past couple of years, especially this year, where number one, he pardons Hunter, and number two, essentially, when he probably should have stepped aside years ago, he essentially keeps it going because I mean, fundamentally, he doesn't want to give it up. So it's kind of interesting. I don't really necessarily have a question here, but what I'm kind of saying is that when I start thinking about kind of these let's say the predecessors, like a George Washington type. I often think of how far and how far we've kind of fallen in some sense, and how far we have to go to kind of meet up to or meet with some of these contemporaries, in spirit or whatever. Because I feel like a lot of politicians, man, they just don't live up to them.
So when you were just talking about that, it made me think of something that's in the book a little bit. I touch upon this. There's John Kennedy gave this great speech in January 9th, 1961. It's 11 days before he was inaugurated. He went to the Massachusetts State House, and it's a speech called the City on the Hill speech. And he talks about what it means, that how history is going to view the leaders of his time and all time. And he essentially pulled out four qualities. So there's four of the qualities that are parallel what's in this book. There's aspect of will be judged. Are he said men of courage? Are we men of integrity? Are we men of dedication? And then are we men of I think it's courage, ingenuity, dedication, and judgment. Last one was judgment. And I think about that in the sense of good history is written every 30, 40 years after an event. It's you need the time and perspective to look at this. I mean, a lot of people want to judge Joe Biden about what's happened, and I think that certainly how this election has played out will determine that in many cases. But I think you look at Joe Biden. Would we say that about him in that sense? If John Kennedy was judging him based on that criteria, how would we view that? I think I don't know if that's lost in our politics, but I certainly think that there's an opportunity and a hopeful optimism that we can look at these types of things, pull some strands out of history, and see and think that we can be a little more optimistic about hopefully where we're going, based on the fact that across American history, if I'm looking at it broadly, we've been to the brink many times, and we've always seemed to answer the bell, or at least we haven't gone over the cliff. And I think its leadership has always done that. We haven't always had the right leaders at the right time, but I think we've had the right leaders at the key times. And I think that to me gives me hope and optimism to think that when we talk about contemporary politics, when we think about where we're going as a nation, that gives me hope.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then here's the question that I would have about the figures that you picked. So, in terms of, let's say, courage, and I want to take maybe a broader view of this. So, when I think of courage, I normally think of FDR, right? So, I think of FDR because for the time, the New Deal policies essentially were, there's a kind of sense of socialism, which is, I mean, this is a little bit more prominent now, but there was a sense that this is communism, we don't want these things. So, for somebody like an FDR, he had to be courageous. So, there was a big backlash, especially in Congress and the Senate. Fundamentally, we didn't want these policies because they were seen as kind of give outs or sort of roads to totalitarianism. So I kind of wonder, in terms of when you're thinking of a bunch of these people, of these five men that you mentioned, so which one of them do you or which ones of them do you find kind of are able to sort of buck in some sense public perception in order to do the right thing? And if that does happen, do you find that sort of toward the end of it, people realize, oh wow, these guys were really, they kind of knew what they were doing, they were doing what was best for us?
So the example I give in the book around courage is Theodore Roosevelt, and I would argue the same way. I think FDR certainly was courageous in what he guided us through two of the worst crises we've ever had. But if stepping back and looking at Theodore Roosevelt, he comes into office. It's 1901. William McKinley was just assassinated in Buffalo. He's 42 years old. He steps in, and he's got to run the nation, right? So he steps in. Two months after so this was September of 1901, and in December 3rd of 1901, so we'll just say 2-3 months after that, he gives his State of the Union address. And in that, when you talk about having courage, he felt the existential crisis in America at that time was the eradication of natural resources. And he believed that he needed to do something about that in that moment, that was his leadership moment to do something around that across the plains, species were being eradicated, lumber, just our resources as a nation were being eradicated through the Industrial Revolution. So that wasn't a big ticket item. That wasn't something that was really debated in cloakrooms in Congress. This was something that he felt personal. It was something personal to him. It was a personal issue for him, having lived in the Badlands. On Valentine's Day in 1884, his wife and mother died on the same day in the same house. He was devastated. A young baby. He took to the plains kind of got his life in order and his thoughts in order and came back. And that's where he started to think differently about a lot of things. And that was one of the things he thought differently about. And that was an opportunity for him to have political courage, to take on an issue that wasn't in the mainstream and move it into the mainstream. So it was not only that, but also this issue for him front and center was the access. There wasn't access to water in the West. There was no irrigation systems. You wouldn't have had a Las Vegas in that time. You needed canals, you needed dams. People only survived by living close to a river system there. So he
Right.
felt by taking those steps in those areas, the West would be the growth of the West would be the dominant story with the United States over the next century. And he was correct. I mean, that's the set that the West has dominated in terms of growth. And for him to take on that took political courage. And I think when you talk about contemporary politics, I mean, there's a laundry list. There's a buffet of issues that we have on the table that maybe we haven't attacked. And the question for future presidents, our current president, our future presidents, what is there something on the docket that they can look to a Theodore Roosevelt and think, I'm going to take courage. I'm going to show some political courage here, and I'm going to move the needle on something that makes sense that affects not only children but the children's children. I think that's to me the legacy of Theodore Roosevelt.
Hmm.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. I mean, if you think about, I guess, something like maybe solar energy, right? I mean, there's great opposition from businesses, like in terms of already how we generate power in the country and the ways that we make money doing that, right? I mean, Theodore Roosevelt also had that great opposition from different business interests, and he had to really push these ideas in order to be able to make something happen. And he was very forward thinking in that aspect. And we do have leaders currently who are very forward thinking. And I guess, like you said, that lesson that contemporary leaders can take is you there should be more of a concerted effort to have that bravery and actually continue to push these new ideas because like you said, this will affect not just your children but your children's children. Maybe this sort of innovation can have ripple effects across time as we go. So no, that's definitely very
Well,
fascinating.
so just to add to that, because
Yeah.
I want to actually, Bill, I want to get your perspective on Teddy Roosevelt here, but I want to actually preface this by saying, so I'm thinking as you guys are talking about this, I'm thinking back to the debate between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders way back now in 2016, where obviously Bernie has been pretty staunch advocate for Medicare for all, and then Hillary says something along the lines of like, look, man, yeah, do we want Medicare for all? Sure, but like, good luck implementing it. So the best that we have at this point is Obamacare. So we pretty much have to defend it instead of pushing for something that's probably not going to happen. So I think a lot of us for a while, especially me at least, well, a lot of us for a while were of kind of two minds about this. So yes, we want progress, but on the other hand, we ask ourselves what's actually possible. So what is it in terms of like the mind of Teddy Roosevelt? How did he feel about that? Because Teddy Roosevelt is in some ways the Bernie Sanders of his time, right? And in his time, he seems to have been more effective because in this, in our kind of age with the polarization, whether it is or isn't sort of more intense than it ever was. The point is to say very little of anything gets done, right, because of political gridlock. So how was it that Teddy Roosevelt, with that sort of Bernie Sanders-esque mentality, how was he able to push through some of his policies?
I mean, and also the point of being primary and not being more risk adverse, right? In terms of trying to push things across. I would just say that I think it's the bully pulpit, right? It's the ability to have the platform, as he called it, to advocate for things. These are things for him, his purpose. These were things that he felt that were personal to him. That was that it embodied what he was, and I think it's certainly a different time in that sense. But I think that there was an opportunity for him to come in and show leadership at a time where he was fresh. He was 42 years old, and most of the Republican leadership at the time were in their 70s,
Mm.
right? So he had an opportunity to move the nation in a way that was different. And I think that it's like almost the exact opposite. Bernie was a lot older in that sense. So I mean, there's certainly a different comparison there. But I think it's the ability to know that that he felt like he could bring America along with him. In the difference of what you're saying about Hillary Clinton in that comparison you just made, everything I've seen or read about him in terms of the study of this, he believed that he could bring people with him, and he had the magnetism, the energy, the just the charisma to do it.
Mm.
And I think, and they don't come around all the time, right? I mean, we only see that, you see that in a handful of these leaders. You see that in a TR, you see that in an FDR, you see that in a John Kennedy, I think a Ronald Reagan. I think there's an element of Barack Obama in there. Like there's a charisma there that you only see in certain times, and you know it when you see it, right? So yeah, I think that I think that that's the difference there. I think he embodied it, believed it, and went with it. Not to say that Bernie Sanders didn't believe it. I mean, he believed it all the way through. Just sometimes it's the right messenger at the right time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And in regards to actually to Franklin D. Roosevelt, he seemed to understand how to inspire confidence even in the darkest times, right? During the Great Depression. What can leaders learn from his fireside chats?
I think it's the fact. Well, first off, there's a number of lessons. One, you don't overdo something. He only used his fireside chats when he needed to,
Mhm.
and he handled them just in terms of overall. He only used them at key moments. And I think that the key aspect of that was he had honed that craft as governor of New York at a time when. So I would compare this in the sense of you have FDR in the radio, right? You
Mhm.
have John Kennedy in television, and in many ways, you have Donald Trump in social media and how they use those mediums to dominate their eras. And I think for FDR, it was the proliferation of radios at a time when that's what was happening in America. You got to the point where you could campaign not off the back of a train,
Mhm.
and basically your message went as far as you could yell it out, to
Mhm.
the
Mm-hmm.
point where you could go from Poughkeepsie to Portland and speak to a CEO and to people working on a farm across the nation, and everybody felt like they were part of that. So he was able to hone his craft at a time when that was starting to come to life as governor. So by the time he was ready in March of 1933 to deliver his first fireside chat, that warm Hudson Valley tone that he had in his voice that
Mm-hmm.
made you believe him, that everything was going to be all right. He had honed that craft. So he wasn't coming in cold. And I think there's a lesson there. I think you don't overuse a medium. He would use the side chats when he needed to. And I think that that was really important. But it was just how he conveyed his message to people that everything was going to be all right. And that is such a stark contrast to Herbert Hoover at the time, who didn't seem like he resonated with Americans. That, I mean, frankly, Herbert Hoover, of all Americans, if you were doing asking for a CV or you're doing a job interview for
Mhm.
president in 1928, he was the right person for the job. Two terms as Secretary of Commerce. He was called the great humanitarian during World War I. He fit the profile for the time, but he didn't exude the confidence that FDR was able to do over the medium of radio, that was able to be transformative in terms of getting us out of the banking crisis. So I mean, there's a few lessons I just mentioned in there, but I think it's there's a honing a craft. There's an element of not overdoing something, knowing when to push the right buttons on when to use the right medium, and I think it's having a message and having and being the right person for the moment. I think that those probably were the keys that I would tease out.
Mm-hmm.
And this is actually something I was waiting to talk about. So I think for that time, having your like especially coming from literally the leader, your message on the radio, going out to the country in a way that it's not just a sound bite.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just a speech that you may do at a rally that maybe at the time, the medium was let's say the newspaper or also radio reporting on what it is the president said. This was a different level of communication where you could actually hear from the leader, like, what are they like? How do they feel at the moment? What's really the heartbeat essentially of the nation at the time? And you mentioned John F. Kennedy, right? In terms of being in film. Okay, I'm with you on there. And
No, that was Reagan.
Reagan, I'm so
Reagan. Yeah,
sorry.
yeah.
Yeah, sorry, my didn't have
Well,
my
Kennedy
copy.
also with the debates, and I think there's an element of television coming in with Kennedy too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what I find fascinating, so you said Donald Trump, right, in terms of social media. What I think is fascinating, if we had to liken anything to Franklin D. Roosevelt's fireside chats, I would say podcasting is kind of the new version of that, in the sense that you can actually, in sort of a long form setting, in the context of conversation, actually see like if the political candidate chooses to be, let's say, uh, on a podcast, you can actually see who they are. I mean, of course, somebody can maintain a persona, a facade for a while. Of course, yeah, you know how to look good and how to portray yourself. But I mean, depending on the length of the podcast, the questions, and things that you can't possibly expect that might happen in the context of a conversation, you actually get to really see what these people are like, more or less.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's fascinating because when you think of, I don't know, let's say a Tulsi Gabbard,
The
uh,
Russian asset.
sure. Or also Trump, Kamala was also on a couple of
Yeah,
podcasts,
she was on a
right?
few things.
But utilizing that medium to sort of get your message out there, I think that's a very sort of a revolutionary way of the people kind of getting to know their leaders or potential leaders.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I think that medium has podcasting specifically has. I'm very optimistic actually because when you, I mean, so okay, I do have to edit this a bit. Did Trump appear on more podcasts than Kamala? Yes. Does he know kind of how to carry himself charismatically, and could, someone who is very confident, and we talk about this on the show, if, from a psychological perspective, if somebody is confident and also an authority figure or has other people agreeing with them on something, and it tends to have people automatically think what this person is saying is true, generally speaking. Like there's gonna have, and there's gonna be an element of somebody's just confident, okay, I'm gonna follow them. So could that steer us in one direction or another, even if that person is charismatic? Absolutely. But uh, I am optimistic because then we may have someone maybe in the future who expresses themselves on this kind of a medium, and maybe we get a very different kind of leader further down the line as far as that goes. I was wondering what your thoughts are on that. I guess podcasting and comparing
And
that to
FDR is the first presidential podcaster.
not quite because
I'm obviously kidding.
yeah, there's no conversation there,
Yeah.
but yeah.
Mhm.
So, I mean, talk about long form stuff. The predecessor to this, it's not a conversation, but it was the Saturday, the presidential message usually came out on Saturdays, and it was like a 5-10 minute message, and the president, but it wasn't an exchange. So I think that there's that in terms of getting a message out. But I think this very well could be the new medium, right? And especially if you have someone who can dominate it in from a charismatic point of view, someone who's a really great communicator. I think about. It was interesting when you talk about President Trump in the sense that there was an interview with Peggy Noonan, who writes for the Wall Street Journal,
Hmm.
former Reagan speechwriter, said she didn't want to meet with Trump because she felt like she just wanted to have a impartial view on him, or just to have a up the middle type of view. And she said that he ended up coming to a few days before the election, ended up coming to the Wall Street Journal for an editorial board meeting, and she felt like he was, yes, he very charismatic, very engaging. And I think that from that perspective, if you have someone who can dominate that and get on one of these have the conversation with like you all and be charismatic and tell stories and be funny,
Hmm.
I think that goes a long way. I think you look at someone, I think about the aspect of someone like Al Gore when they talk about the 2000 election.
Yeah.
They said a lot of the criticism to Al Gore was if he had just, kind of opened up and been himself, and that could have been a different outcome for him. Again, a podcast, something like this, is a great medium to be relaxed and have a conversation, show your personality more. So I think that there's an opportunity here for that, as opposed to the one-on-one hard-hitting questions like a traditional our ABC,
Yeah,
NBC
like
type
Meet the
of
Press.
interview.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Where you can relax. I think about Obama. He did the podcast with the one escapes me. It was the gentleman in his garage in California. What's his?
Mark Maron. Yeah.
Yeah, but it was but also he wasn't running for president at the time. It was the end of his administration, his second term, but you can have those kind of conversations, be more relaxed. And I think the more, I don't know, as I've seen and studied presidents and particularly them running, the more that they can be themselves and be authentic, it surprises me. Like that's the way I would go if I was advising them. That's what I would do, and I think you see that in the authenticity of an FDR on the radio. You see that with Reagan, with the way he would be really self-deprecating about jokes about his age and how the Thomas Jefferson say something about Thomas Jefferson 200 years ago and how how old he was, and he was in the same room as Thomas Jefferson. Those types of quips. I think you leverage what's your quality, and for him, Reagan, it was a sense of optimism, but he also had the timing and the comedic chops, and I think you leverage your best assets, and I think Reagan was someone who was able to do that at a high level.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think in terms of speech, I think most candidates, I mean, if I had to guess, obviously, I think most of them are afraid because a lot of them don't sound like FDR. And what's so interesting, since we were on the topic of FDR, did you guys actually know that? So, because FDR, a lot like Martin Luther King, used to write and rewrite his speeches. So, in terms of, so the Pearl Harbor speech. So, what happened is that the initial wording of it was something along the lines of like, this day is going to live forever, right? And so FDR is like, I could come up with a better word than forever. I don't know if forever was the right word, but it was something along those lines. And then literally he came up with infamy, right? Like, who the fuck says that? This day will live in infamy.
Sure.
So now it's something that, we kind of reiterate over and over again. So yeah, and I think what's so interesting about that is that like with somebody like a Trump, I just think because you could call it charisma, overconfidence, whatever. He just doesn't care. I think he thinks he's brilliant. Every word that comes out of his mouth is amazing. So when he goes on these shows, he's like, yeah, I don't give a fuck. Everybody's going to like me, which for maybe not the most part, but for some part is true. But I think when you have somebody like a Kamala who's, pretty censored in some ways, self-censored in some ways, I think a lot of them, man, try to live up to an FDR, whomever, like a Martin Luther King, where they think unless every word out of their mouth is poetic, nobody's going to want to hear it.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue to your point about FDR. Yeah, the word choice. He hit it for the bent of his. I should say his first fireside chat. He had someone from the DNC write the speech. He ended up ripping it up, laid on his couch, and dictated it to his assistant, and it just came out. And I think about the aspect of someone like when we talk about social media and today, someone like Abraham Lincoln, I think would dominate in the space of podcasts, in the space of 180 characters. He was someone who could write with the best of them. He believed in the idea of Mark Twain's idea of the difference between the right and wrong word choices, the difference between a lightning bug and lightning. But he is someone that again was very like he went draft after draft after draft. He would scribble everything. And I think some of the best presidents are the ones that do that. Like Ronald Reagan in particular, with the whole thing with the Berlin Wall speech about Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. The entire interagency process, the NSC, the State Department, up until the moment he was giving the speech, did not want him to say those words. And he was like, I'm saying that because that's what I believe. And the best communicators are the ones I think work on that. Like you say, infamy wouldn't have been the same if FDR wasn't minute about that and got in there and dug out that. I think the best communicators are the ones that do that kind of stuff. But I would say, Lincoln, to your point about podcasting, I think he would dominate today because he was such a great storyteller too, the amazing storyteller.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also to your point, if I'm not mistaken, the Gettysburg Address was 250, 240 words or
272
less?
words. Yeah.
272? Yeah, that's impressive. And that's one of our most famous speeches ever as far as that goes. So yeah, he would definitely dominate Twitter.
Yeah.
That's just
well, okay. So then moving on. So actually, I want to now kind of get into FDR. So, all right. So Bill, can you get into FDR? And obviously then again, going back to the quality that you chose for him and actually get into some of his policies and some of, I guess, the barriers that he had to try to overcome.
Yeah, so FDR came into office 1933 with the low point of the banking crisis. Stock market had crashed. Most of America's wealth had been pulled out of banks. People were hoarding cash. They were going to the bank, taking their cash out, putting it under their mattress. They were putting it in the underneath their seat in their cars because they thought that they were going to lose it all. So FDR had to come in at a moment. So again, there was the longest one of the longest periods in terms of the crisis itself. So there was a November election. FDR didn't come in until March. So all of this is happening under Hoover's watch, to the point where FDR was like, they could have probably come to blows at some point between Hoover and FDR and how they were handling that. But since that was such a long period, we agreed that we would never do that again. There was probably the longest period between an election and inauguration in American history in terms of what was happening in the nation besides the Civil War. So at the time, FDR comes in, needs to put a pause, almost to show the nation that we've hit the bottom in terms of the crisis. So he comes into office, closes all the banks, puts a bank holiday on for about a week, runs through a series of regulations, series of different measures. Interestingly, when he came in, he didn't have a plan. He basically he said his whole point was to make it up as he went. He was using Hoover's staff along with his own staff. Hoover's staff stayed as a sense of patriotism to try to help what was happening so we didn't collapse. But it was basically throwing stuff against the wall to see if it stuck. And Republicans basically went along with Democrats and gave FDR whatever he needed to keep us afloat. And part of that was a delayed opening of banks. So he wanted to make sure a number of banks were solvent for an opening of business. And then it was essentially a progression after that. But he went on radio about a week after he was inaugurated and wanted to explain to the American people what had happened over the course of that week. In plain terms, why they felt the need to close the banks. What did that mean? Very, like I said, warm Hudson Valley tone, but just to explain to people so that they would understand it. To talk to not only the CEO in New York City, but the farmer in Iowa, so they could all understand what was happening and give that sense of confidence in the nation that we were going to be okay. And I think that an amazing crisis in itself. I mean, you could write a crisis about, like you said, about December 7th, 1941 as, again, courage. But I think we may not have had 1941 if we didn't have what happened in 1933, saving our bank system, saving the United States from falling apart from an economic standpoint. We could have had civil war out of that. It could have gone in a lot of different directions. So FDR was his confidence gave the nation confidence. And interestingly, his confidence was something, again, that went back to his childhood, back to the Hudson Valley, back to his mother more than anybody. His mother instilled in him a confidence that he could do anything as a child. And it was her just physical and it just asserting that in him certainly guided him through all of the challenges through his life, through polio, through just a range of challenges he dealt with. To have that type of confidence, to give the nation confidence, is amazing story in itself.
Wow. Was it ever shaken from what you know?
I mean, certainly polio would do that to someone, right? He was in 1920, he was the vice presidential candidate for the Democratic Party. They lost. He came back and had to, in 1924, in the Democratic National Convention, had to get up in front of the convention without and basically teach himself how to walk, in a sense of using braces, and the stress and physical stamina that took to do that, because one stumble, any just look of weakness, his career would have been done. He got to that podium, gave an amazing speech, amazing endorsement of the Democratic candidate, and from there was able to leverage that into being governor of New York and then to be president. But again, if that had been on television at the time, who knows what would have happened. But he passed the eye test in 1924 with polio, with brackets on his legs to be able to do that. So I mean, I think you certainly, even someone with the greatest confidence, you have to be a little shaken when you have that kind of something like that happen to you.
Hmm.
But he never let it get him down. And there's a great quote by Eleanor Roosevelt talks about that she's never seen or experienced anyone who had that kind of power to lift themselves up and to do things that really normal people, or according to her, could not do.
Right. And what's so fascinating is that it wasn't even a braggadocious confidence like with Trump. And so you have this guy. So to me, just to be on the record, FDR is my favorite president of all time. I don't think that there's anybody even close to him. So for me to think about it in terms of, okay, so here's this person during World War II, even though they obviously didn't enter the war because of the Nazis, it was because of Japan. But the point is to say, like, to think at the time, now we kind of take it for granted that, oh, Americans, the Soviets, and obviously Britain defeated the Nazis. But the way that, I mean, again, it's something that's just like, I don't know, commonplace to us. But to think about it in that context at the time when Hitler was essentially taking over everything, to think like, wow, man, he actually was willing to enter World War II, even though I understand they were bombed. But the point is to say that he was a superpower, Nazi Germany. So to think not only did he face the Great Depression, but he also faced Nazi Germany. And then on top of that, yes, he was confident, but he never took it overboard. Like, I just wonder how that's possible. Again, for him not to have, honestly, the ego the size of the planet. I just don't get it.
Exactly. I think I go back to when before we had gone in and trying to help the Lend-Lease programs, the ingenuity around that to try to help Britain through that time, knowing that probably we were going to get into the war at some point, but to be able to kind of stand them up to a point where we could get into the war. Again, just the ingenuity of him. Certainly had missteps like trying to pack the court, and there's aspects of FDR that I mean, I think you look at all of it, but I think there's, again, top three in terms of just the range of crises. I mean, I think that's you do a world war, you have the financial crisis. I mean, it's an amazing realm of that. I think to me, FDR, again, probably one of my favorites too in terms of just the personality of it. And I think that there's also a level of FDR which is interesting from a personal standpoint, that it's very hard for people to get close to FDR. Like even historians who write about him, we think we know about him, but there's an element of him that there's just a little bit of a guarded percent. There's like that 10%. Same could be said about Ronald Reagan. There's an element of him that there was always guarded and you couldn't crack it. And I think that that's a neat component of him too. And maybe that's part of what made him great. I don't know, but yeah, I think that aspect is pretty interesting.
And I know you said FDR is one of your favorites, but it's a little bit of a cliche question. But if you had to pick an absolute favorite from the six presidents highlighted in this book, who would you pick and why?
I would pick Lincoln in the sense of, I know that that's like a popular choice. Obviously, he's considered the best president, but I just think going back and looking at it, I've spent some time at Gettysburg, and you just look at what America was going through at the time and just what he did to keep the nation together at such a difficult time. If you see the pictures of him in 1861 versus right before he died, 1865, you just see how that war wore on him personally and what that meant to him to go down into the war room and to read the cables coming in and just to see, just to embody what it meant to keep the Union together. To me, I think that it's just an amazing gift to the nation and to the world. But I look at the fact of what I tease out in this book is the Gettysburg Address. And we talked about that. It's 272 words. And I think when I talk about keeping the Union together, it's a sense of dedication. And I think that that's it. We talked about the top with the aspect of Kennedy talking about dedication as one of those qualities. And I think that the best presidents are the one who are dedicated to doing the right thing, that are dedicated to the future, right? To the children's children aspect of this. George Washington talked about it in this idea of the unborn millions, right? It's this idea of that America is an idea that we're thinking about that vision for the future, thinking about what does that mean what is that going to mean for America, generation upon generation. And I think to me, Lincoln embodied that, and I think the Gettysburg Address embodied that in a speech that was 272 words. and knowing how Lincoln labored on every syllable. It wasn't just a speech, but it was also just it was a verbal expression of communicate. Like it just was just it was pure. Like he wanted it to sound right and roll off your tongue. I mean, we still listen to that today, but in 272 words, he used the word dedicate or dedicated 6 times. And I don't think that is, that's not by mistake. And in that sense, to me, that exudes what he is and what it was about, not only in the Gettysburg Address, but his presidency was about dedication to America and continuing the American experiment beyond 1865 and beyond the Civil War. And to me, that stands as above anybody else the greatest gift that he could give the United States and to posterity.
Wow.
And I know this is something that we touched on a bit, but I'm curious. I guess besides some of the political leaders, more contemporary political leaders that we've mentioned, are there any that actually remind you of any of the six featured in this book, or maybe carry some of those traits? I know we touched a little bit mentioning Obama, and then maybe Trump in the context of like I suppose confidence.
Yeah.
But maybe someone else who maybe stands out to you
More in current times or just across this?
more in current times.
I mean, I'm trying to think in terms of if you want to look at Joe Biden, we've talked about this aspect of stepping down like George Washington did in the sense of um, stepping off stage. I think it's hard to say that in the context. I mean, I think you look at folks that from a sense of political courage, I think I don't know. I think there's an open question about that. I think you want people to hopefully are giving you a sense of optimism. Are there leaders that do that? I think on both sides of the aisle, I think there's people who do that for that particular group. I'm looking for the person who's going to be more, let's be that leader that's going to move the needle and bring America together. And I think that that's what this
Right.
book does in terms of the six leaders in this. So I don't know if I have that over time, but I will say this in terms of the book itself. I like to try to give examples of leaders or presidents that embodied those types of qualities, like ingenuity, someone like John Kennedy in the space program. Whereas I in the book, the focus is on Jefferson and the Louisiana Purchase. But there's folks in terms of if you look at an optimistic spirit, someone like FDR drove optimism, right? So of course, Ronald Reagan is the one I chose, but FDR, I mean, that was him. It was that he gave optimism to people, but he also gave confidence. So from a current standpoint, I don't know if I have great examples for that. I think you also go back to history and you say you need time and perspective to know whether
Fair.
what
Yeah.
the kind of leadership they're providing is that was that good for America or not? I don't know.
Yeah. In terms of ingenuity, I would actually put in Obama just because in terms of at the time healthcare and you know I mean we don't have universal healthcare, but at the time especially with the Clinton administration, I mean that was a pretty big focal point of many Democratic campaigns. So for Obama to actually put it together into something actionable was really at the time it was just wild. You know, now I mean obviously people complain about it usually, and honestly the reason is for the most part they usually complain about it because it's underfunded, but they don't understand why, and it's because of the Republican Party. But the point is to say for the Obamacare package and for the exchanges, for the system to be put together, to me, that's genius. Because to run a healthcare system in this country, first of all, we already have a million problems with the healthcare system, but to actually run a nationwide healthcare system is just, for me, at least in the early 2000s or whatever, was unthinkable. So
Yeah.
So I'll jump in for if you're talking about more contemporary presidents, Obama, I think one of the things that strikes me is this element of grace or empathy. I go back to his speech in 2015 in Charleston, South Carolina, with Reverend Pinckney after the Charleston Mother Emanuel church massacre there, and he went up in front of giving the eulogy and sang Amazing Grace. Again, we won't know 30, 40 years. Is that a key moment? Is that something we think in terms of a rhetorical presidency? Was that a moving moment in some respects? I think of someone like George W. Bush in the sense of his PEPFAR program saved millions of people across Africa, something that he could have not done. It's something that the Obama administration kept going. And I believe the Trump administration, Biden administration have kept it going, but it saved millions and millions of people around it for AIDS relief in Africa. So something like that. I also think about aspects of this book about qualities that didn't get into this book. Someone like Harry Truman's decisiveness after FDR passes, right?
Mm.
He was kind of in the dark, particularly about the nuclear weapons, all of
Mhm.
this. He had to step in the middle of the war, 1940, April 1945,
Mhm.
and take the lead. He had just become the vice president. He came in the year prior, so he basically was a new vice president and became a new president. Walked into his first cabinet meeting full of all of FDR's people and said, "I'm the final decisions are going to be mine." Basically the buck stopped with him, and to have the courage to be able to do that and the decisiveness to do that, I think is pretty incredible as well. And then I'll throw in one more, a
Mhm.
more contemporary president. Beyond the scale of this book is George Herbert Walker Bush in terms of his Gulf War charge, the fidelity
Yep.
of going in, liberating Kuwait, and saying that's it, and I'm out, and that was it. And I think the fidelity of honoring what was happening with the UN charge there, I think, is also speaks to him and his sense of fidelity throughout his entire life. And I think you see the decisiveness in Harry Truman's life. I think you see that sense of grace and empathy in Barack Obama's life. So just some extra thoughts on some more of the contemporary leaders we've had.
Mm. Yeah, and then so like as we're kind of starting to wrap up, so I want to give a fair or somewhat fair space to Ronald Reagan. So Ronald Reagan is by far the president outside of Trump who I hate the most, and it was because I actually believe that his optimism was completely misplaced, and he was also a person who didn't take criticism, feedback, whatever, pretty well. But I will give him a fair space. So Bill, tell us about Ronald Reagan, why you chose optimism, and tell us about some of his policies.
So I think you look at the second half of the 20th century, the Cold War dominated it, right? So you think about what was a key moment in the Cold War. Lots of debate around that, right? There's the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's other aspects through that. SALT treaties, other things that are happening. But I think in terms of you look at Ronald Reagan, he had spent from 1981 to 1987 really hammering home this dynamic with the Soviet Union to the point where he went to Berlin on the 750th anniversary of the city, and he knew that this was going to be the speech of the Cold War, and
Mhm.
he felt this was a moment for him to say something that was going to be meaningful. And for him, he had gone to Berlin. This would have been the third time he was going, but he had been there twice before. And he had a visceral reaction to the Berlin Wall and seeing it and seeing what had happened around people getting gunned down at the wall trying to cross it. And for him, he felt like that was the symbol of the Cold War. It was the symbol of that if this wall came down, there would be the element of glasnost and what Gorbachev was talking about. And he said that he looked at Gorbachev in the eye in Geneva, in Reykjavik, and felt like he had a partner that he could work with, and he felt like he could push Gorbachev, even though, as I said earlier, a lot of the NSC, the State Department, didn't want him to say what he was going to say about tearing down the wall.
Mhm.
They didn't feel like they wanted to push that hard, but he did, and I feel like there's an element of courage there. There's an element of to me, I think those are optimistic words to tell Gorbachev to tear down that wall because 29 months the wall came down. And in my view, there's people who don't have that view. I'll say some people say that Reagan was pushing at an open door, right? He was pushing at different forces that were happening. But I think it also takes a moment to put a marker in the ground, and that's what he did. And I think what he did also did was giving hope to people on the other side of the wall, to give them
Mm.
hope that this was possible, that the president of the United States was sitting there saying that this wall had to come down. And I think that to me, that's an optimistic statement. The wall came down 29 months later, and I think that that was a key moment in the Cold War, and that's why I chose him and that aspect of leadership around optimism.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And there was no indicator, I think, at the time because of Soviet propaganda that the Soviet Union was collapsing. So, to be fair again to him, that was a pretty courageous thing to do because it
Yeah.
wasn't that, there was any for mostly, I would say for most people, that there wasn't much forethought and thinking, okay, well, this is going to end anyway. And again, it's kind of Reagan pushing through, I don't know, I guess a door that's partially open or whatever. I think at the time, nobody really knew that. And it's like, I think for a lot of us, well, not me, obviously, I was a kid, but I was like a child at the time. But for I think of our parents and a lot of the
Yeah.
people who were watching, I think it was a huge surprise for the country that the wall came down and obviously the Soviet Union collapsed. I think what, like a year after that or something.
29 months after, yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
so Reagan had left office, and it happened under the George Herbert Walker Bush administration. So it was
hmm
1989. So it was 2 years later, 29
yeah.
months.
Yeah. So I guess was if to ask you a little bit of a personal question then. So I guess what is your sense of the Reagan or the Reagan version of optimism? So do you feel like for not just Republican candidates, but for any candidate, but mostly for Republican candidates, do you feel like some of it has been misused? Do you feel like it's largely been beneficial?
I think Reagan's sense of optimism is the idea where you see it in 1984 when he talks that it's morning in America, that our best days are ahead. And I think that that was the optimism he gave. And I think if I was tapping into that as a Republican candidate, that's usually the more hopeful candidate wins the election. And I think you
Mhm.
see that over the course of history. And I think that's what resonated with Reagan. And I think it would be good for all of our politics to resonate and hopefully with that sense of America's best days are ahead.
Yeah, because from what I remember with Jimmy Carter, I mean, he was a little bit more realistic at the time. And so, again, I wasn't a part of this, so it's kind of hard for me to really talk about from what I know from what I read or saw about it. I think the idea was with Reagan, I mean, he brought in a sense that people, so he pretty much kind of in some ways told people what they wanted to hear. So here was Jimmy Carter, and he was like, hey, listen, guys, there are these problems, we're going to try to resolve them, etc. And then Reagan came in, he's like, no problems. He's like, there's great prosperity coming for all of you.
I think that Jimmy Carter in I think it was 78 or 79 he had a crisis of confidence speech
Mm,
where he said essentially we had a crisis of confidence. And I think anytime your leader is telling you that, even though he was he was being fair about what was happening,
Hmm.
didn't give the nation confidence. In the same way, there was an element of Hoover and FDR in that sense, where FDR came in and gave the confidence and optimism that Hoover did not. I think Reagan did the same. But I will say that the sense of optimism that Reagan, it wasn't manufactured. As again, going back to his childhood, Illinois, he was the son. His father was an alcoholic. Would kind of skip out for days at a time, and there was this sense of optimism that Reagan inherited from his mother and her guidance, similar to FDR in those parallels. That there's that sense of optimism that went through his entire life. So that again, in 1987, called to the moment, it was something he was cultivating over the course of his life. So it wasn't again, he's probably the right man for the job at the time if we're talking about the Cold War compared to Carter. And I think it was something he cultivated across his life.
yeah, yeah. Poor Jimmy, man. Another one, another great one outside of FDR. But yeah, I feel like in terms of just campaigning, I mean, people just don't want to hear that, man. That's why, like the slogan "to make America great again," which literally came from Reagan, or at least from Reagan's, operatives. I don't know if Reagan was the one who came up with it, but yeah, essentially, it's like if you don't kind of feed people that, man, you're kind of out. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right then.
Something I really should ask, I suppose, before we end off. What do you hope readers or no, 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 I'm going to rephrase this. How can young professionals who read this book, how can they develop these six leadership traits in their early careers? Because you take somebody like a Washington, he literally went through battles in order to learn the ins and outs from success and that version of success and failure. I guess what would be that version for us or younger readers?
So I would argue that that a young professional has cultivated these qualities over the course of their life already. They've been
Right.
tested, and I think that's what again getting back to the core of this book. I think it was to tease out what was about these leaders at that time, and I think you could look at your own life and see what are the things. How am I meeting my moment along the way? I
Mm,
think everyone's going to have to meet their moment. I think that's what's interesting about this book. It can make you think about what is that moment? Have I had it? Is it something in my career? Is it something in my family? Is it something in a corporate boardroom? Is it in the classroom? Is it taking a moral, ethical stand in my community around this? I think that, I mean, that's what I think about. And I think about the aspect of, if you want to learn something about these leaders that are essentially monuments and statues, George Washington, what is the one thing that you want to take away? For me, it's his judgment. He didn't get it all right all the time. He got the big things right. And I think that's, if I was taking that away from this book to share with young readers, young professionals, that's what it is. And it's different for everybody. That judgment may not be that may not help you meet your moment. It may be a sense of optimism. It may be your sense of confidence, and it's different for everybody. And I think that's what's unique about these 6 presidents. But I also think that's what's unique for me, you, or a young professional that might be listening to this.
Wow, I love that. All right. So, Alan, as we wrap up, final questions for Bill?
Yes. If we wanted to follow you, follow your work, and of course, buy the book, where can we do that?
Best place is williamhaldeman.com for all things me, and you can find your book at basically any outlet. Usually, it will have that.
Perfect. I love how concise that was. Bill, thank you so much for this, man.
This is a pleasure. Yeah.
Such an excellent episode.
Yeah. I love this. This was great. Really appreciate having me on.
Absolutely, man. We'll talk to you soon.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay. What a way to end off the year, by the way.
I know, right?
Right? Presidential podcast before a new president comes in.
Before the world goes to shit.
There's something stylish about that. But anyway, everyone, again, thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to follow us, you can follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram. On X, we're at Seize_podcast. Like, subscribe, hit the bell on YouTube. And again, thank you so much for watching, and have a happy new year.